Welcome to Real Coaching Radio, the podcast for coaches by coaches. We are here to teach you how to get the most out of your clients and yourself. This is where beauty meets the beast, brains meet brawn, and science meets, well, bro science. Welcome to Real Coaching Radio.
So today I'm here with Chris and we are going to be talking about percentages and RPEs during training, potentially which one is maybe, I say better than the other, but probably more applicable for you, depending on where you are in your training journey is a better description of what we're going to go through. And yeah, hopefully help you understand which one you should use, where you should use them, where they're appropriate, and all those sort of things to help you make better progress with your training. So first of all, I think we should just define what RPE is.
Yeah.
And then go from there. So for those of you that don't know, RPE is essentially a rate of, it stands for rate of perceived exertion. I guess its main difference between that and if you were to use percentages, which are going to be based off your 1 rep max, is percentages are very, very objective in terms of you have a specific number. You know, if your 1 rep max is 100 kilos and you're going at 90%, you're obviously going to be at 90 kilos. It's a very clear, definitive, black and white, this is the number. RPE is a little bit more subjective and based off, as the name suggests, your perceived exertion. Yeah. So essentially, how hard do you find it?
Yeah.
Originally came from something called the Borg scale, which was designed by Gunnar Borg, which was a scale of 6 to 20, and was predominantly based for cardiovascular based training.
Yeah.
Whereby if you were to times that number by 10, or quite simply just shove a 0 on the end, you would get some form of reflection of where your heart rate should be at that given time. So if you were at 13 on this scale of 6 to 20, your heart rate should be showing in around 130 beats per minute, right?
Yeah.
I think for the ease of the fitness industry, we converted that into a scale of 1 to 10.
Yeah.
Just because, if you're working with a client and go, on a scale of 6 to 20, how do you feel?
Yeah. How's your heart rate feel?
Well, where's halfway? And so it's very difficult to figure out. Whereas 1 to 10, obviously much easier to figure out. Again, that was still quite in its early days, still, I guess, based more on cardiovascular based training. And then I guess in more recent years, things like reps in reserve have started to come into play. Pretty much all the same thing, right?
Yeah.
People just giving things different names and different ways to figure out things. So yeah, that's pretty much a little summary of what RPE is. And as we said, percentage is just pretty much based off your 1 rep max. So in terms of what's more applicable, where we use them, how we use them, we're going to go through all those things for you guys in today's episode.
Yeah. So on that, which do you think is more effective for training?
Long term, I think RPE.
Agreed. Definitely.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Like the whole idea of it being subjective, obviously it has its limitations, which we will talk about. But the idea that you come in and train based off how your body and psychological place is much more effective to get the most out of your session.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we know this. And if you've ever been to the gym for a string of time, you're probably going to know this in terms of, some days you turn up to the gym and you're like, I feel wicked.
Yeah.
Let's go. Let's push it. Some days you turn up to the gym and you're just like, don't really feel it today. Yeah. And I also think the good thing about what RPE does then is, because there have been times where I've probably been a little bit stuck in the ways in terms of, I'm following this program. The program says I must do this and I must do that, and I'm going to follow it to the letter because I believe that's what's going to give me the most progress. And there are days when I come in and I'm not feeling it, but you still try and do it. And realistically, it's never going to end well.
Yeah, detrimental.
Right? So it's either going to end in your risk of injury increases slightly, just because you're not as prepared for that session as you should be, especially if it is a session that's hard, that's planned, or you just leave feeling a bit crap because you haven't really hit what the session has said you need to be hitting.
Yeah, and it also can affect your fatigue for the rest of the week. So if you're already at a point of overload, instead of achieving recovery and getting into a place of overcompensation and adaptation, you're in a place where you're just further in the hole. And like if you have more sessions that week, you're just continuously adding dirt onto the pile rather than effectively training. Yeah,
and I think kind of that goes back to some of the previous episodes we've done in terms of like managing fatigue, but also managing fatigue, but I guess managing your own fatigue and expectations of training in terms of now on, especially if you look at things like social media, it's kind of like, oh, just go hard all the time, all the time. And we seem to be in this area, especially on social media, I think, where everything is like mega extreme ends. And things just get blown out of context quite a lot. So it's either you're going full send every day, never going to end well, or you're kind of, you're resting, but then people just end up taking that way out of context and just go, oh, you're resting way too much. And it just...
Or even just like, which is kind of related to the percentages thing, is like being so clinical that there's no way you can really effectively train like that long term, because you're not a science rat in a lab.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? You're not going to have the perfect situation every time you go to the gym. So being adaptable to that situation is key for long-term, happy, enjoyable progress.
Yeah. And I think that's probably the biggest thing in terms of you are not this kind of like science experiment that's in a lab. You're not a list of data points. You're not, all these equations that we get given, regardless of what it's for, is kind of never really match up to the living organism that changes all of the time.
Almost never, because like, even if you would think I have the perfect programming with like the best coach and I have the perfect gym environment, then 80% of your day is outside the gym.
Yeah.
80% of your day isn't in that program. Yeah. It's around your food, your sleep, your stress. Like if you were in like a stressful situation in a car for like 3 hours of your day, that's going to significantly impact how you then approach training, and you don't have any control over that. So how do you definitely know, oh yeah, but today's PB day. Yeah. Today's the day I need to hit this percentage for this many reps. It's like, how do you know your body's going to be ready for that? You can't foresee the stimuluses that you're going to have outside the gym.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point. So let's go, because I think there's going to be a lot of people that go to the gym, whether they follow a program or they have a personal training coach or they have a program given to them by a coach, or they just go in and kind of wing it every day. There's going to be a lot of people that attend the gym that at some point in that day, they've potentially come up against something that has been more stressful than they expected it to be.
Yep.
Whether that be, loads of traffic on the road, or flat tire, or mega stressful day at work, or even down to not fueled appropriately.
Yep.
And then obviously they've got this gym session. So what would you say to somebody who kind of, probably experiences those things realistically on more days than not?
Yeah.
And then approaching training and managing their expectations of their own training when they potentially got this plan to follow and can never really follow the plan, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, like, obviously, in terms of like approaching stresses, so a thing that I think we've spoken about this before actually, which was like having a whoop, which is quite a good example of this. So having a whoop, obviously you're seeing your sleep data and potential stress or fatigue throughout the day from this data point. And a big argument against something like a Whoop or an Apple Watch or whatever is that it's providing you with a form of managing expectations that isn't your own. So it's almost like RPE from a technological piece. So you're looking at it and you're going, oh, I got red sleep last night. I'm probably not going to train very well. That's going to instantly affect how you train anyway. So I kind of think of RPE as the same as that. It's like you're kind of balancing between so objectively, how much stress and fatigue does my body have? How can I measure that? Okay, so how much sleep did I get? Have I been fueled appropriately? Have I been sat at my desk all day? And then subjectively, how do I mentally feel about this? How enthusiastic I am? How motivational do I feel? and trying to find a point between there, because I think the only problem it comes when you look at something like RPE is you can, if you're not as experienced with your body, feel like, well, I'm pretty tired today, I probably shouldn't push through. And then if you're a certain type of person, more often than not, you won't push. So you might still go in and train, but you'll often not be progressively overloading and you won't get the required stimulus. So that's like a point that you have to take into account. So I would say when you're using RPE, you should always set yourself maybe some sort of limitation of, well, at least here's the bottom ranking of what I should be hitting for today's stimulus. Ironically, that could be percentage based. But if I feel better than that, I should build from here up to a place where it still moves well. And like something I've definitely said to people at Origin, but also clients, is that in a way, it doesn't really matter how you feel, it's how it looks. So like if the bar is moving quickly and you're moving in a really efficient way, it's probably all psychological if you feel like shit. A little bit.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, because like I think one of the biggest, like we said at the beginning, I think long-term RPE is the best way for you to manage the intensity and monitor the intensity of your training to see long-term progress. But I think the biggest limitation to RPE is, do you actually understand RPE?
Yeah, definitely.
And I think some of the problems that people are going to come up against is this scale of 1 to 10. There's going to be a huge amount of people who actually, do you even know what 10 feels like?
Oh yeah, have you ever reached 10?
Have you ever been to 10?
Even close to 10.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's going to be some people who are kind of, well, I think I'm at 10, but like probably at about 7.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the biggest, so when you're approaching the gym after you've had these, whatever it might be, multiple string of stresses, a stressful time at work, whatever it might be, it might be an idea for you to, as Chris mentioned, maybe think of RP as potentially like the long term, I'm going to utilize this to monitor my intensity, but then utilize other tools that you maybe have available to you. Yeah. So that could be, we're kind of starting to tie the two together a little bit.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
My minimum stimulus here is going to maybe be 70%.
Yeah. Anything above 70, 75. I mean, like we know most strength gains are made in the 80% range. So you want to be hitting 80% as often as possible when appropriate and with like the appropriate dosing. So I'd say that, you want to start around 70. Let's say you feel like really bad, you feel really tired, start at 70 and maybe end at 70. But if you feel pretty bad, but you're going to start at 70, you probably surprise yourself. You'll probably move to above 80. And then if you feel good, start at 80. And then move from there.
And then the other thing is kind of like you said, not necessarily just all about how it feels, but what does it look like. So maybe film your first couple of sets.
Oh yeah, that's so good idea.
And like look back at it and go, well, actually, like it felt fairly heavy, but like it's moving quite quickly.
If the bar speed doesn't get slower throughout your sets, that's a pretty good sign you can keep building. As soon as it starts slowing down on video, then you can go, okay, this is probably the shift in the gear now kind of changed to a heavy weight. And then make sensible decisions based on that. But I do have a good question, I think, which is, how would you get somebody to test what their 10 is so they are more adequately ready to choose between a 1 to 10 scale?
So I think that's difficult to do.
Cardio and strength-wise.
I think that's difficult to do with beginners. I think probably cardio is a little bit easier to do with beginners, literally
just get on
because...
an echo bike.
Sorry?
Just get on an echo bike.
Well, and I just think you kind of... The thing with cardiovascular is we do have some good references for kind of like max heart rate and those kind of things.
HR,
so we can probably do some form of cardiovascular tests and actually see how close we can get you to like your estimated or predicted max heart rate, and then give me some sort of reading from that. Whereas with strength, it's going to be a little bit different because we don't really have any indicators of just like, well, how strong are you?
Yeah, and I mean, a big problem with strength, particularly with beginners, and this is what we'll probably go on to about who should be using percentages versus RPE. One reason which I personally don't like using RPE with a beginner, for example, is that a reason they might move really slowly is because their technique is poor. So they might grind out a weight that is technically like a 75, 80% weight.
Yeah.
And they might be like full, closed hinge squat where they're basically kissing their knees. And of course, this is really hard because this is a poor squat mechanic pattern.
Yeah.
And therefore, to them and to the observer, it's a 10.
Yeah.
But the actual physical weight is easily could be squatted if their form was better.
Yeah.
And therefore, that has a massive effect on perceived exertion.
Yeah.
Because they might literally get to 60% and it's flying.
Yeah.
And then they get to that point, but their core and back are just not strong enough. They don't keep in a good position. And then 70% is suddenly 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So in that scenario, with a beginner, what would you do?
I think this is like where the balance is, because this is another thing we've all talked about in the gym a lot. The balance of like, you do want to strip someone down and get them to be moving mechanically sound before they start adding too much load, but you also need them to load to progress.
Yeah.
And you can't get them constantly stripping down the weight and being in this perfect position. But what I would probably do is I would start off working with like a perceived percentage.
Yeah.
So from watching them lift, I'd be like, okay, so I saw that 60% was about their 60%, and then suddenly it got really hard. So I'd be like, okay, let's work in this range at like 65, where it's difficult, and they can get loading without a massive breakdown of form.
Yeah.
I'd build capacity there, and then get them to move. But another thing, which I think is like really good specifically, I'm really thinking about squats right now.
Yeah.
But is actually do high volume through sets with low volume in the sets.
Yep.
So doubles, for example, where you're moving with a fairly heavy weight, but something that you could probably squat for 6, but you do a double really well, but you do loads of sets, like in an extended EMOM form. So let's say every 1 minute 30 or 2 minutes, where you're practicing that movement pattern. And then once you had one day building capacity, one day where you were doing like doubles or triples, and then when you come to the next week, even with a linear progression, you could be like, add a little bit of weight to the capacity and to that. And I think that makes a massive difference. Yeah.
I think for beginners, kind of like just building general capacity through exposure to repetitions really is going to be their main route to progress.
Yeah.
So the way, because I guess this is probably like, the only, based on the brief conversation we had before we did this podcast, we maybe take slightly different approaches with beginners. And I think this is good because this goes to show that there's no, and I think we get sucked in within the fitness industry where like, there must only be one way to do things. There's a million ways for you to do pretty much everything. So I would take I'd say a slightly different approach, but it's not drastically different. I would do exactly the same as you in terms of, I would probably do lower reps within a set, but more sets. And so for me, I would look at, I generally look at programs and how I write training sessions as 3 different components. So there's a skill component, there's what I would call a train component, and then there's an output component.
Nice. Okay. Which is that's almost like you could do the same way, like strength, hypertrophy, conditioning.
Pretty much, yeah. So for me, so if we were to take someone like yourself, who's way more advanced, we could get you to use a back squat or use a deadlift, and you could use that movement in both the skill element and the train element, because you've got the ability to push the load on that. Whereas beginners won't have that. So I might say I would probably take a back squat and realistically not worry about what is even on the bar.
Practice the skill
until it looks good. But what I would then do is, so we do however many sets and reps that we're going to do on this back squat on the given day, but then we're going to get on a leg press and you're having it.
Max output, What was it that George Shallow said? 2 brain cells all the way through, mate.
Yeah, exactly. So just because, and again, I think this could be a full episode within itself. Kind of, I think some people can get sucked into the actual exercise. Whereas I like to take a little bit of a step back and get sucked into the stimulus.
So that's a really good point. Like following on from that is, sometimes to improve your squat, you don't need to squat. That's the thing. Like you need to, like we've been talking about this a lot with the way we're training now and the way we're looking at approaching training now. And probably, again, we'll probably do an episode on this through Conjugate, but like a big part of how we train now is like we focus on weaknesses when we're looking at, let's say, the output and capacity element, the accessory element, which is effectively improving the main lifts, whether it be squat, deadlift. So we're improving our hamstrings, lower back, core.
Yeah.
Generally the weak areas of people's squats because they're using a lot of their quads anyway. And then when they go to squat, they hold a better position and they can squat more, even if they haven't squatted as much volume or intensity on another program. And another way I really like what you were saying there is actually something took quite well from my PT course was progressive versions of the skill. So something I do a lot with my clients because of that is you start with something like, okay, let's look at this person's squat pattern. They do an air squat. And you look at their squat pattern and you go, okay, this person obviously doesn't have the mobility in this area yet, doesn't have very strong glutes in this area yet, or doesn't have a strong core. So let's start with a goblet squat. They start with a goblet squat. They move to a next variation. So then they might go to a front squat, depending on the mobility. And then you build up, whereas actually the last exercise you end up doing is the most advanced.
Yep.
And then they've built the pattern and the capacity in different ranges to then squat a back squat and move well with a back squat. So that's like the skill element you're talking about, but also you have that progressive build. And I think, so like that's part of like motor pattern learning and developing the skill set. Because that's another thing as well, is like we were talking about form and technique earlier about rate of perceived exertion. It's kind of the same in the sense that most strength adaptations are probably going to be neurological, especially at the start.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
They're definitely going to be the way your body is working together to create the optimal biomechanical position to move.
Yep.
And therefore, building that in as a skill, learning it, and then, like you said, having a capacity element for the hypertrophic, strength capacity response.
Yeah, because if we can build that capacity and build, just give some form of strength stimulus, then we're going to get, especially if they're a beginner, they're going to be like a sponge, right?
Oh, yeah.
They're just going to get strong so much faster, stronger, faster, right? So if we can just expose them to that stimulus, but also when we're on the leg press, for example, this goes back to your original question, was kind of like figuring out where 10 is. When I'm on the leg press, I'm looking at two things. So there's two main things that I'm always looking for with clients, and once I see these two things, I know we're getting results.
Yeah.
The first one is, regardless of the exercise, I want to see that you can do it correctly.
Yep. Yeah. Move well.
Then the second thing is I want to see your ability to push.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah.
So for me, it's kind of like if we go back to that squat exercise, I might squat with, whether it be goblet squat or empty barbell back squat, whatever it might be. We progress that as the skill. So that's me looking at you going, right, can you do this well? Can you do this properly?
Yeah.
And then at the moment, if we're in a position where we can't load up that back squat and you're on a leg press, it's kind of like, right, so when this starts to get hard, what's your response?
Yeah, can you push?
Do you keep going?
Can you push? Yeah.
Or is it kind of like the set ends for you there?
Yeah, because I think like most people stop when it becomes uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
And actually, like probably the biggest defining factor between a beginner and an intermediate is the absolute unwillingness to initially push past something because it's hard.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of the time, for example, when I see people and they come into a class and then you see them pick up the same pair of dumbbells infinitely.
Yeah.
And you feel comfortable with those pair of dumbbells, but that's not going to make an adaptive response. Yeah. It's like you are working, you might build some capacity. Most likely you're going to be conditioning the muscle. Yeah. You're going to be conditioning, in that way. However, you will not get bigger. You will not get stronger. And the reason is because there is no progressive nature to it.
Yeah, there's no real stimulus.
And that's
there,
because the next step up feels more uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it's going to be harder to get through that workout. And ultimately, the biggest thing I noticed with me as I got into more conditioning after the strength work is I was so good at pushing with the strength work, but I really didn't want to push when it came to the conditioning. And I was always like, I won't go to quite RX. I'll kind of just scale a little bit below.
Yeah.
And the biggest difference came when I was like, I'm going to go slower but go heavier.
Yeah.
And I'm going to move through this conditioning piece. It's going to be harder and I'm going to feel more uncomfortable, get less reps. But then there's a big adaptive response.
Yeah, but I also think that's another example of actually where RPE probably comes into play at being a little bit more at the top of the tree than what percentages are. Because if we take somebody like you who, you know, power to weight ratio, like incredible, like mega strong for your body weight. So, you know, we look at your squat and we look at your deadlift and you go, and then you try and transfer that across to some form of conditioning tool, whether it be, right, we're going to be doing devil's press or whatever. Most people would just go straight away, well, this guy's mega strong, so it's 22.5s, right?
I suck at the echo bike.
But it's such a different, you know, I think the ability to push when it comes onto, let's say, full send on a, you know, max reps on a deadlift or leg press or whatever, and then compare that to an echo bike. It's a very different feeling.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, so that's another, so again, whole different podcast in itself about energy systems, but yeah, like obviously there's different types of rate of perceived exertion depending on the stimulus. Like even within cardio, between the energy systems, lactic buildup versus max heart rate versus long, arduous, I need to keep my head in the game. Like they all have different feelings of I want to give up. For sure. And depending on the day, one might be easier than the other. Sometimes a 30 to 40 minute workout, you're like, oh my God, that sounds like a long time. But actually in it, you're like, oh, I've just found a pace, so I just keep moving. Whereas a less than 10 minutes can be absolute hell. And you could literally be like, I want to end this after the first round. And when we're going like full send on the echo bike, 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off, that is like the most painful thing I can like that. For me, that's a 10. Like when I get off and I'm gasping for air, that's what I perceive as a 10. That's totally different when you have a long workout, and it still could be a 10. Over time, you could get to the end and be like, I have nothing left. Like glycolytically, I kind of literally can't feel my body.
So it's about understanding kind of like how the RPE fits into
what you're training,
the workout that you're doing as well.
So do you think there is an appropriate time to use something like percentages? Do you think there's a better time to use it, or a certain population should use it?
So I think the only real time, to be quite honest, where I would use percentages is with people who are who I would class as relatively elite, and or extremely consistent. And the main reason for that is
a science rat,
exactly. And the main reason for that is because, as we mentioned earlier, most of the general population that are going to be going to the gym they have so much other stuff going on that, you know, in a priority list of things in their life, exercise in the gym might be number 6 or 7. It's still important to them, but they've got so many other things that come ahead of that. Whereas if you've got somebody who either they're training, you know, almost full time specifically for their sport, and or they're mega dedicated to just going to the gym, and the outside stresses that they have going on in their life at that current time in their life are really, really low level, I think those people could potentially use percentages because there's so many less variables that are coming into play.
So essentially what you're saying is like, you know, the closer it is to lab conditions, the closer you are to being, you know, a number. The closer you are to be able to be analyzed, I think is better to use that kind of training. So interesting enough, like from a perspective, when you think about when you start in the gym, technically you're using RPE automatically. But just the RPE counter is just so off. So often what happens is people start with RPE and they don't really push, and then they go into a program that has specific set out variables, even if that is something we kind of haven't spoken about is just like linear progression. And the fact that, you know, linear progression is neither a percentage nor is it RPE. You literally just adding weight to the bar each time you go in. Obviously we know that's not very effective for very long, but initially it gets you out of ignoring the fact that that feels heavy, because you could add more on and you still make progress. Yeah, so like that is interesting. That like you almost start at RPE anyway. It's just a poor version. An observation I would say that when I think about RPE, it's much more effective to think less about how does that feel and more about how many more of that could I do. Mm-hmm. I do prefer the reps in reserve specific methods. So when I look at an RPE, I will count down from 10. So if it's an RPE 9, it's probably 1 rep in reserve. Mm-hmm. You know, a basic level.
Yeah, same.
8, 2 to 3 reps in reserve. You know, and I'll just go down like that. And I think that's much better because that gives you a good idea of like how strong am I feeling today.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting alternate question.
Yeah.
Do you think there's objective measures of RPE you could potentially do coming into the gym as like a ritual to be like, how am I feeling today in a more objective manner? For example, I know quite a famous example is like grip testing.
Yeah.
So you'd go in and people would like test grip before, and then that would give them a good idea of neurologically how switched on are they, how much can they push it. Is there any examples of that you can think?
So I actually think, so I talk about this in the PT course, whether you remember this and this is what you're talking about, or
the
this
dots.
might, So one thing I have used with people previously is either, as you mentioned, the dots, or I don't remember what they're called. Those things that bounce that doormen have. So I'll kind of like, right, 10-second burst.
Much you can.
Either how many clicks can you get, or how many dots can you put on a piece of paper? And then you count, and then you just count them up.
Yeah.
And then sort of, obviously at the beginning, you're going to have to get some form of baseline. So like, you know, and the reality is the first time you ever do it might actually be a day where you're not feeling very good. So, you know, it's a bit like figuring out.
Take an average.
It's a bit like figuring out your calories on the first time, right? You're going to have to give it a couple of days to figure out where the average is and where you're starting. But then moving from there. So if, for example, I started to get, 30 dots within 10 seconds. And then the next day or a couple of days later, I'm only getting, 18, 19 dots. But like, well, I'm a little bit sort of slow today. And kind of, so I might use that as a measurement to actually like pull back a little bit in my training session. But weirdly enough, one thing I do find is, so take yesterday, and this is a good time to talk about this, because yesterday, as an example, training yesterday, to be honest, like started training and probably wasn't really feeling it. I was sore from Tuesday's session. I was a bit fatigued from Wednesday's session because it was a lot of conditioning, and I went into yesterday's session not really feeling it. Now, fortunately, that session was like, more velocity based, so like the weight was lower, so it's just a bit easier to get through. But what I did find was after I'd done the plyometric section, I felt way more awake.
Interesting.
So I do think there is something in kind of whether people start to build this within their warm-ups and that kind of stuff, and maybe where there's potentially then a question around if you're going to use RPE because you can use RPE in multiple different scenarios. You could use RPE for a given exercise, right? So I'm going to back squat and I'm going to go at RPE whatever. But you could also have RPE for an overall session, the session as a whole, right? So there's a potential question around, well, when do you figure out where you're going to decide what your RPE is? Because there's a time frame where you might come into the gym. So take yesterday, for example, and before I started warming up, and someone said to me like, "How are you feeling about today's session?" I feel a bit trash, to be honest. I don't really feel good. But if I'd have maybe, which I didn't do, but if I'd have maybe put some plyometric elements into my warm up, and then you asked me after the warm up, how am I feeling about today's session? You may have got a very different response.
So I think we've unlocked something here, but I really agree with that in the sense that so I'm big on like neural drive. I think like neural drive is one of the most important training factors for me, because I can go in and feel absolutely trash, but if I go and set up a certain environment whether it's the people I'm with, the music I'm playing, the amount of caffeine I've drank, whatever it is, whether it's my annoying shouting, whatever it is, there's a collection of things that get me to a state of which I am more heightened and ready to lift.
Yeah.
And I truly believe that when people see that, they just think, oh, I'm just getting overexcited, or I'm kind of being obnoxious because it's like play for the camera or whatever. But truly believe I couldn't do half the stuff I did unless I got into that state.
Yeah.
And I think that, therefore, a good thing leading on from that would be like, instead of thinking of a warm-up purely as, are my muscles warm?
Yeah.
You should be warming up that neural drive. So as your warm-up goes on, you should also be switching on or becoming more
absolutely
focused and intense.
Yeah.
Because obviously you could go in, like I've heard examples of, strength coaches shaking all their baseball players' hands before they come in for training to see who is a bit more switched on than the other people.
Yeah, nice.
Right? So they can tell from the limpness of their grip or whatever.
Yeah.
And so obviously the handshake is like so subjective because it's from both people, but it's a good signifier to be like, okay, this person needs more attention. So, jokingly around, you could be like, well, my RPE for the day, because I'm feeling a bit crap, is 3.
Yeah.
But then when you get into a certain environment and you see someone's not doing well, and as their coach, you're like, okay, let's have a little bit of fun or play at the start of the session to engage them. And then the rest of the session might be way better than if they come in a low mood and then you're kind of like, okay, let's get to work, let's warm up. And they're just like, I just feel like shit, I don't want to do this.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point, because if you're a coach and you're listening to this podcast and you're training clients, then there's maybe something for you there in terms of if your client's turning up to the sessions, and there's times where I obviously like to get to our gym, you see they have to walk down our corridor.
Yeah.
There's times where like I will see, I'll just observe the client walking down.
And
you can kind of tell straight away, and I actually picked that up from, I can't remember who it was now, but it was years and years and years ago, where I can't remember who it was, but there's somebody I knew who was like, he was a chiropractor. But his office, the window in his office overlooks the car park.
Yeah.
So, and obviously, like when you turn up to some of these treatments, and you're kind of like, oh, I'm just gonna, one of the first things some people say is, oh, I'm just gonna have a look at your posture. People will just like stand bolt upright with perfect posture.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, but he never really did that, because he did his initial assessment watching them walk from the car to the front door.
Yeah.
Because they knew no one was watching.
Yeah. Great.
So they're just in their natural state. So he's kind of already, and he was pretty switched on. So like, he pretty much almost figured out what was wrong with them before he'd even seen them.
Well, yeah, and we see these people like every day.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
exactly.
It's not even like that woo-woo to be like, if you see someone every day, when you see them in a lower state of energy and mood, they're probably not going to perform as well in the gym.
Yeah.
So being able to engage with them in that sense, and that even comes to like, obviously when you were talking about effectiveness or efficacy of training, what point of the day you're training, depends on how you should warm up.
Yeah.
If you train at 1 PM, you're well fueled, you've had a couple of coffees, you're feeling pretty all right.
Yeah.
You probably don't need the same kind of warm up as you if you come in at 6 AM in Origin.
Yeah.
You're going to need a little bit more like oomph and drive.
Yeah.
You might need a little bit of a chat to warm you up socially.
Yeah,
you just got out of bed. You might not be switched on to then go lift a heavy weight.
Yeah. I know that if it's early and I'm going to lift heavy, I need like a little bit of a longer, extended warm up. I just need to like, my joints need to feel better, and I just need to feel a bit more ready for the session. But I also think there's something in, kind of going back to your original question, I think there's something in the subjectiveness of RPE, but then trying to relate it to some form of objective thing as well. Because I think the problem with something being just 100% purely subjective is you can become a little bit attached to it. Yeah. Whereas if we take the example of where, you put dots on paper and just go, oh, I feel crap. We're just like, yeah, but this is the most amount of dots you've ever put on a piece of paper in that time frame. How you feel. It's just like, well, and interestingly, going back to Whoop, I listened to a podcast with the owner of Whoop on. And he said some interesting things, which I think can be a little bit controversial for some people. And he actually, I think he pretty much almost, I'm not going to quote him on this, but I think he almost pretty much said like those exact words in terms of like, it's not always about how you feel.
Yeah.
Whereas
Data,
Whoop will figure out these things that you don't necessarily feel, or it'll potentially figure these things out before you even feel them.
Yeah.
Which in some ways can be good, but in some ways can be detrimental. Going back to, because I am a big believer in kind of like some of the stuff that you were talking about in terms of, if I wake up and my Whoop says, "Oh, I shouldn't train today," like, am I just not going to train? But I feel great.
Yeah.
I'm probably still going to train.
Or it might make you not feel great because you've seen that red. Like, it literally has an effect. Like, we know from Instagram, you see a like pop up, or you see that little heart symbol.
Yeah.
It has an interaction with your brain, which releases dopamine. If you see a big red, you feel like shit. It's gonna have that interaction on your brain. Definitely.
Exactly.
Where if you see like 80% green, you're gonna be like, even if you feel exhausted, you're gonna be like, oh, I feel pretty good actually.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, okay, so that's a good one though, because when we're bringing up Whoop, we're talking about an objective measure, which is heart rate variability. Yeah. Okay. So on that, I would argue heart rate variability is a good predictor. Yeah. It's probably the best predictor we have objectively. Yeah. Do you think there's particularly good scenarios to use heart rate variability? Like, is it better for strength? Is it better for cardio? Yeah. Is it better for, skill focus, concentration?
So I would probably say it has maybe like a bigger negative impact on cardio.
So if you poor heart rate variability, your cardio will suffer.
I think so. But one of the interesting things about heart rate variability is, I think sometimes we can use it incorrectly but the overarching thing is still the same, because all of the data on heart rate variability shows that like the things that have the biggest impact on heart rate variability are a lot of the things that are outside of the gym environment.
Yes.
So for example, like if you're at university, you've got exams coming up, that's going to have an impact on your heart rate variability.
Definitely.
If you've got stressful times at work, that's going to have an impact on your heart rate variability. But like, so I think if we just like relate it 100% to training, we're missing like a lot of context. But obviously, like we did say at the beginning that, in reality, you spend a very small amount of time in the gym and spend most of, the rest of our day. So there are so many other elements that come into heart rate variability that are not gym related. Yeah. Yeah. Which, are there potentially other things that we can do to remove some of those stresses before we attend the gym? Whether it be things like, I don't know, you just go and go out, you've had a pretty shit day at work, you just go and get a coffee with your mate before you go to the gym. Could that massively change your mood? Which, is not necessarily going to have an impact on your heart rate variability instantly, but it might have an impact on...
Might even have a negative impact on your heart rate variability. So here's one thing I want to, very clear about heart rate variability, where I think Whoop, there's like a little bit of a misline. Heart rate variability doesn't mean recovery. Yeah. Right. And in Whoop, it translates that the better your heart rate variability is with an algorithm of other factors equals your recovery. Okay. So, for example, if I do cold showers and ice baths, my heart rate variability will improve dramatically. It's going to really improve the functioning nature of my heart. Yeah. However, if I do an ice bath after training, that will reduce my recovery by preventing adaptation within the first 4 hours, arguably 2.5 hours after training. Therefore, despite the fact that the next day my heart rate variability would be better, my muscle fatigue would still be higher, and probably therefore I would lift less even if I had a green on the Whoop. Yep. So that's a compounding factor that people need to realize, that these factors are all just partially recognizing part of your recovery. And there's other things like we understand as well, like on a slightly more deep level, that if you go through certain experiences in your life, such as trauma or a horrible event, even if your body feels good, your central nervous system is going to hold some level of impact from that, like fatigue
100%.
Or just not be able to get. I'm pretty sure if I had a close friend or family member die, I'm not going to create the neural drive honey badger, normal chrysalin I could normally create. Yeah. Even if I had a week off, I'm perfectly recovered, I've had all the calories in the world, I guarantee that the feeling of finding out that news and then trying to lift weights would be nigh on impossible. Yeah. There is no... there's obviously the physical or physiological effect, but it's got nothing to do with recovery or to do with... But the RPE that day would probably be wildly off.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true, because I 100% know that within myself, because But training's been pretty decent recently, but kind of in the last couple of years, it's probably been the worst it's ever been in my life.
Because you've had the most stress.
Because I've had the most stress. But if you just looked at it on paper, just like, well, this guy turns up at the gym at somewhere between 6 and 7 a.m. most mornings and doesn't leave until somewhere between 7 till 8 p.m. in the evening. So like, it's got all the time in the day of the world to train, which is true. Like, I'm at the gym all the time, but I've also had a baby, moved house, went through COVID, opened the gym during COVID. Yeah. And so all of these other compounding stressors have had an impact.
Yeah. And so I guess probably some like final questions that would be good to ask, like that are very applicable. In what ways, I'll start with an example, but in what ways do you think RPE would be like, considering that we think it's the best factor, a general statement is, like anything, you should progressively overload it. Yeah. You should learn a better image of yourself over time. You should make clear objective measurements. When I felt like this, I lifted this weight. Yeah. When you then feel like that again, let's say you make your own scale, even if it's 1 to 5, be like, well, I roughly lifted this last time, so I'm going to go back and try and lift something similar to that or more. So try and get some objectivity into it. But when do you think RPE is a poor filter to use? So for example, RPE would be a really ineffective filter to use if you had constantly novel training, right? So I can't imagine using RPE if I was constantly varied in terms of like, if you don't have a relatable stimulus or a lot of experience or growing experience with that stimulus, aka a squat once a week, how can you possibly know what it feels like? Yeah. And even with us, when we're doing conjugate, we're constantly changing the variation of the squat. But even over a 10-week block, we're realistically doing 10 squats over and over again. Yeah. So it's not a squat pattern. But if you're like CrossFit, doing 50 different movements a week, how the hell do you judge, especially when the movements are together in different forms? How do you judge RPE then? Well,
exactly. And I think, and to be honest, I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons why we're starting to see, and we've never really seen this because CrossFit, people doing CrossFit as such has been around for God knows how long, because it's just training really. But like CrossFit as it is still relatively new. Yeah. And to be honest, like, we're only really seeing people come out the other end of it going, how many people have you spoken to that have like, I did CrossFit for like X amount of years, just felt like really burnt out and like got loads of injuries. Exactly. So that just goes to show that it's not a particularly effective way of managing the intensity and the stress of your sessions, because what you probably end up doing, or what people try and do, is I think it comes from like multiple different factors, but people's perception of CrossFit is they watch the CrossFit Games, right? And then they just go like, oh, well, that's CrossFit, so I'm going to basically do the CrossFit Games Monday to Saturday every week for the rest of my life. WODs. Yeah. WODs. Which is weird, because things like rugby have been around for so long, and then like people who like watch rugby, like rugby, start getting interested in rugby, go, I quite fancy playing rugby. Like, they go to training sessions, you don't just go, I'm just going to play a match every day. Yeah, it's true. And also you go to training sessions, you go, I need to do some runs to get fit for rugby, or I need to go, squat to get stronger legs for rugby. So you recognise there's other factors that build into what is rugby. Weirdly, we don't do that with CrossFit. Yeah. I mean, this is what we were joking about the other day, about the fact that these things that create CrossFit separately are like the basic tenets of fitness. Yeah. You need good conditioning, you need good strength, you need some level of mass, so hypertrophy to move the bike or whatever it is. And then when people came out and said the really obvious statements of like Rich Froning saying we need to do some bodybuilding to improve our capacity with CrossFit, people were like, oh my God, that's such a good idea, we should do bodybuilding for CrossFit. And then Matt Fraser was like, I do lots of Zone 2 training. Everyone started doing Zone 2 training, like speaking about Zone. New. And for the last 10 years, they've just been doing high-intensity WODs every single day and never do any Zone 2. Yeah. And it's like, well, because the basics are the basics. Yeah. Whatever sport you're in. Yeah. So I think there's two main areas where RPE is probably not applicable. The first one would be what you said, in terms of if it's just constantly varied because you've got nothing to compare it and relate it to. Yeah. And I think the other big one, is just like, if you actually have no idea what RPE is.
No experience,
So, but then the only real way you're going to gain experience is by exposure to training. But if you're that new, like you said earlier, the reality is like most of the adaptations and changes that you're going to see at the beginning are going to be neuro adaptations. So you can almost guarantee you're going to get stronger every week.
Yeah, definitely. And, your body responds in many different ways when you're new to training that will build growth. So, on a reflexive to that, what we're really saying is if you cannot use RPE, that is more of a critical lens to look at your training, to be like, why can I not analyze my training through how I feel to manage it well? And it's either because there's a lack of experience or knowledge about how feeling relates to psychological feeling, relates to neural drive or whatever. The answer to that is you probably should get a coach. You probably should be in a training environment where someone can, even in a class, someone can be like, hey, you should push more today. I don't really feel like it. Yeah, but I can see that you can push more, so trust me. So that's how you solve that problem. And then if you have far too much novelty that you have no idea how you relate that, that's probably because you've got too much novelty. You probably need some more consistency. You probably need to train within some more basic parameters and have that clear, okay, even if it's like we were talking about this with our training, 3 weeks periods where you do the same exercise, just so you can feel the difference between a few times. And ultimately, this all comes down to the more you get in the gym, the more you're moving, the more you're going to recognize, hey, I've moved 1,000 times now. I've got a good idea when it's good and when it's bad. Like even I felt absolutely crap yesterday with training. I knew I could move this way still well though. I can at least do this. Like I knew I couldn't do a max heart rate cardio session or a max squat, but I knew that I could do something fast. Because once I woke myself up a bit, it's pretty lightweight. So it's just moving with intention.
And I think that's one of the other reasons why you should probably get a coach, because if you don't, and you could have gone in yesterday and gone, oh, I don't feel good, and going back to what we said at the beginning, your two options are probably either, well, I'm going to have a go anyway, maybe get hurt or just get more tired, or I'm just not going to bother. Neither of which are really going to get you to where you want to get.
Because ultimately what we're all searching for is the minimum effective dose. We're all searching for, we want the most adaptation with the least stress to ourselves and our body over the longest period of time to get the maximum results. And for that to happen, you need to be consistent, but you also need, and to be consistent, you need to not be injured. You need to not be burnt out. Not think training is shit because you keep failing PBs. This is another thing. If you're constantly failing PBs, your RPE is probably dog shit. You need to probably look at your training and be like, I'm training too hard too often. Or I'm not progressively overloading enough to hit these PBs.
I think if you're going to the gym like 4 or 5 times a week and over an extended period of time of somewhere between 4 to 12 weeks, like you're not getting stronger, something's off.
Unless you're in the top 1%. And I can guarantee you're not. Sorry.
Pretty much.
Sorry.
I think if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably not.
Sorry. But I think the takeaway from that is RPE is a really good tool. It's the most effective tool that we have to create good training. However, if it's currently an experience lack issue or currently you don't know how to fit it in, this is where you would be like, let's search for someone who can do the thinking for me and I just move, which would be a coach.
Absolutely. And you can gain feedback and give feedback to that coach who's then going to have a better understanding of how you feel and how you move, your responses to certain stresses, and all of that can help educate you to understand your RPE, but also help your coach. Because when I start working with someone who's brand new, like, I don't know what their RPE is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is just a general point. We all think we know ourselves a lot better than we do. Like, generally, it doesn't matter how self-aware you are, you're going to ignore a lot of the negative points about yourself in most situations. And somebody who is literally paid to look at it is going to be like, no, that's probably not right. You probably need to focus on this. But so get a coach.
Cool. Guys, thanks for listening.
Good place to end.
We'll catch you on the next one.
See you later.
So guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode there. Chris and Mark have a way of kind of discussing things which hopefully gives you a different feel to these episodes. They probably dove in a little bit deeper than I even possibly could. But what they have been working on, along with Jasper, is the Origin method. This is something you can pick up and kind of get involved in. It's a different way of programming to hopefully help you get towards your like performance or competitive goals, whatever they be. If you do want to look at that, you can go to origin-series.com and find all the good information there. Same as always, if you can give us like a 5-star rating and review on both iTunes, Spotify, if you can screenshot this episode and tag either Chris, Jasper, myself and Mark within this. If you can't find our Instagrams, they're in the description below, or they'll be in like the show notes, so if you need to find them there, you can look there. If you are looking to become a personal trainer, you can head to www.myptcourse.com and find all the information there about the future courses that we do have going on. Similarly, if you do want to look into more education or more mentoring stuff, you can go to, again, originseries.com as well. But hope you enjoyed that one, guys. Thank you for tuning in. This is Real Coaching Radio. We will see you on the next one.